and welcome back to Box Popcast, the weekly pseudo-academic roundtable of pop culture analysis with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am once again here with all of my co-hosts. We have Wayne and Katya and Hannah. How's it going, guys?
Hey, Mav.
Well, it's about the same as the last time, but I think more importantly, we should ask who is winning the box office game right now.
There's a box office game result. Wayne has a commanding lead of like $900,000 as we record. It might be
not when this airs. Not when this airs. When this
probably
airs.
Not.
When this airs, Raya and the Last Dragon will have hopefully given me a slightly commanding lead. We're talking hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars.
So tune in next week.
Which movie did I make money on?
You made on Nomadland, which came out months early because they're like, why not? You know, it's a pandemic. Toss a movie out that isn't going to make any money anyway. So Hannah, you are hoping to be in the lead by the time this airs. I mean, you're hoping that people brave a pandemic to go out and see Raya and the Last Dragon. Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if we're going to play this game, we're going to count the numbers. And but like I'm saying, hopefully in the sense that Chaos Walking is your movie and is out this weekend. It's limited release and delayed by like 2 years. Nomadland, limited release, and also I believe on Hulu streaming.
Yeah.
And now we have like a Disney animated studio film that's gotten pretty good reviews. And so based on how numbers work,
you might be winning for the first time ever in this game.
That's not fair.
Has she never been in the lead? What?
I don't think so. Have you?
No, I'm pretty sure I was in the lead when like Serenity came out like 2 years ago.
Oh, okay.
No, that's how movie out.
Okay. Well, there you go. All right. So
my strategy with Nomadland wasn't like I knew it was going to make like $12, but given that it's Frances McDormand, I figured critic score would give me $11.97 of that.
Yeah.
I mean, you were correct.
That is accurate.
But again, stay safe. Don't be irresponsible. Don't do anything that makes you uncomfortable. Don't just go see a movie to give us money. Not that anyone was ever motivated by that.
I also really enjoy that, like, Wayne's strategy is like the polar opposite of mine, which is like, does it have explosions and monsters? I want it. Will it get a critic score of like roughly 2? Yes.
So speaking of, and I don't know if this is a real transition or not, but we have a topic today. This is exciting. Something exciting happened.
Do we not normally have a topic?
No, but this is an exciting topic because it's like relevant and in the news and everybody is talking about it because of what happened last weekend. Obviously, I'm talking about Cop Rock, which we are ready to discuss because that's why you're all here. You're here to talk about Cop Rock, which was talked about in depth, very much in depth, mind you, on the most recent episode of John Oliver. So that's what we're doing this week, right?
You know, the really unfortunate part of a pandemic is I can't punch you right now.
Yeah.
I think I'm in the wrong recording session.
Yeah, we're not talking about Cop Rock, but we should. We're going to do an all Cop Rock show one day. The voice you hear. We're going to talk about WandaVision. This is a show that everybody's loving. You know, everybody's here to talk WandaVision, and we invited a guest. I want to welcome to the show for the first time. We have Tara from the There Was an Idea podcast. Hey, Tara.
Hi. How are you? Thanks for having me today.
What was your idea?
Ask Nick Fury.
Well, so Tara, I should give a little bit of background. I don't even know how. I think you left a comment on one of our Instagram posts way back, and it was just like, and your name was An Idea Podcast, and I got the joke, and I'm like, oh, okay, An Idea Podcast, like from Marvel. Okay, so I went and listened. I love your show. Tell them what your show's about, just so they know.
Thank you so much. And yes, when I was first starting my online presence for the podcast, I found your show and immediately went, this is incredible. This is exactly the type of thing that I'm aspiring to do. Although I specifically started with the MCU as a contained area within pop culture that I was going to dive into. So I have been a huge fan of pop culture since I was a very young kid, and movies, music, TV, games. It hasn't been enough for me to just consume these things. I become immersed in it and I want to create, and I crave an active aspect to my engagement with media and with pop culture. So last year So last year I finally started a podcast. And as you said, it's called There Was an Idea, ellipsis, a Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. And my spin is that I organize the movies by larger concept or theme. I have a new guest or guests on with me each week. And we take a somewhat academic approach to discussing the movies. In season 1, I looked at identity formation in 8 of the solo films of the MCU. And then in season 2, I dove into the idea of collective identity and relationships and communities within the team-up movies of the franchise. And now for season 3, I've been doing weekly shows on WandaVision, tracing big ideas, themes, motifs, character development, general reflections on its approach to storytelling, with various guests bringing in their unique perspectives. And I'm a teacher, and that's a huge part of my perspective that I bring in. I love it. And I've had on a lot of teachers of different subjects as guests on my show who bring in their unique lenses. And I've also had on people who are completely new to the MCU that I picked a particular movie to be their entry point and kind of had them bring their lens to discussing that movie. And then I've also had people who have been diehard fans forever. And this season, I've also been able to bring on some other podcasters and also an acquaintance of mine who has written some Marvel novels. So it's been a lot of fun.
Cool. Very cool. So I thought you'd fit in for this one because I'd been wanting to have you on for a while. And then it was like, oh, well, you've been doing a WandaVision recap every week. And we just didn't have the energy for that. So we didn't do that.
So we will just be replaying excerpts of your episode while we all sit in silence right now.
I mean, well, but we don't usually recap things like that on this show anyway. We always we like to wait till the end of a Game of Thrones or something and just like look at big picture. And yeah, well, and then Hannah will bring it up every chance she gets about how she hates it for the next 2 years. So
Okay, look. I'm sorry that it traumatized me, okay? It was legitimately one of the most upsetting things I've ever watched on television. It just hit all the right buttons, okay? And WandaVision is different. No, you brought it up.
But see, WandaVision is about trauma. It's about trauma. It's a great show about trauma. So
not comparable to what I'm describing with Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah. Well, everybody in her... That's right. Everybody in her life died. Everybody in Wanda's life dies, and she has to create a whole new reality to cope with herself. But Hannah didn't like a TV show, so it's pretty close.
Very similar. Very similar.
What is interesting about WandaVision? I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. Is that, and how it ties into this, is that like it shows you like the power of television in like how Wanda imagines her world. Like she uses sitcoms as an escape. So, actually being upset over a TV show or enjoying a TV show, not that bad of a thing.
I agree with that. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, all of us who were raised by television, it's sort of how we have been taught to organize our thoughts about the world. We all kind of expect a solution to things in 50 minutes plus commercials, right?
Yeah. It's also I want to get into like WandaVision more substantively, but I think also yes, it's an illustration of like the importance of television and media generally, but it's also like a really great illustration of what's the problem like of taking media too seriously, because she literally creates a fictional reality based around like Leave It to Beaver. And it hurts people.
To be fair, it's not Leave It to Beaver, it's the Dick Van Dyke Show.
I know it's not Leave It to Beaver, but it's like, but the idea of like the world is not a sitcom, and when you try and pretend that it is a sitcom, problems be happening. Which is kind of like the parable of what happened to the 1950s. They're like, oh, we're going to ignore issues of like race and gender.
Well, it's the whole. I need to simplify the world around me.
Yes, absolutely.
Because that's easier than dealing with these bigger problems and issues.
Of course,
which is why sitcoms in general are comforting. Like sitcoms make the world into a little digestible like nugget that we can deal with in 30 minutes.
Although very interestingly, like as the show goes on, it moves through the decades and does like get more complex and complicated. Like some of the sitcoms that are airing now that do tackle like very serious issues, but somehow make them digestible.
So I definitely want to get into the themes and stuff, but I'm also kind of curious. I'm probably the least MCU literate person on this show right now.
That's interesting.
But I'm interested in what people's reactions were to this show, because I really loved it because there's like vintage fashion and I do enjoy superheroes and explosions, so it had everything that I enjoy. But I don't know how the comic book folks
I want to start with I want to start with Tara there because so your show is specifically you are a fan of the MCU, and that matters because you're not particularly a comic book fan, right?
Right. And it's more that I'm not a fan, not because I don't like comic books, but because I have not gone into that world, which, as we were kind of speaking to before we were recording earlier, it's difficult to get into a world that has so many different writers, so many different timelines, so many years of establishment over the course of the comic books. So there's something about the MCU as a cinematic franchise that feels much more contained, much more manageable. And for me, as a fan of movies, it was something that drew me in. And so I am not very aware of comic storylines at all. I'm always fascinated when I speak with other people who are and talk about the connections or lack thereof between the MCU as we see it on screen and the comic storylines. But yes, to your question, my goal and my area of interest and expertise lie just in the films.
But you have seen them all, and you've seen them all, and I believe you've seen all the associated television shows, right?
I have not seen all of the non-canon MCU shows, so I'm very much contained to what is considered part of the Kevin Feige produced, Marvel Studios produced MCU. So I haven't seen, for example, Iron Fist or the Defenders. I've seen Jessica Jones, which is fantastic, but I haven't seen all of those in their entirety. I will someday.
So that does put you further ahead than Katya because you've not even seen all the films, right? You've seen most of them, right?
Me? No,
Yeah.
I think I've seen all the films at this point. I probably have seen less of the TV shows.
Okay.
I also just have a short attention span. So my ability, and there's a lot of character. Well, like even I do think
just to bring you up to speed, we're talking about WandaVision.
Thanks, Wayne.
No problem.
But like, I think even like the cinematic universe is much like less sprawling than the comics because I mean, you could theoretically you could watch everything over the course of a couple of weeks and like get up to speed. But I think even then, like the amount of like interconnections and like I have a hard time. I feel like I would actually need to study the MCU in order to like fully understand everything. So like I enjoy the
flowcharts. There are legit flowcharts now.
I know, and as soon as it gets to a point where like I need flowcharts, this is like I really admire people in like gaming culture that like get deep into lore and they know everything about. I was watching a really great like 30-minute YouTube video yesterday about somebody deconstructed the entire history of trolls in Skyrim. This is completely off topic. I feel like it's related. Sort of like the commitment that takes is insane. And
Absolutely.
I wish I had it, but I don't. I don't. So I admire people who can keep track of the MCU. I just watch it and go like, ooh, explosions and yay, people having cool fights.
I mean, we do a podcast where we do an academic paper once a week, every week for the last 3 years, but we're mostly drunk during it. So,
but I think it's also like I mean, we've talked about this offside. I am a breadth person. Depth is not. I'm a breadth and synthesis person. Extreme depth and detail oriented like study of a subject is. Once it gets to the point of flowcharts, it starts getting complicated. I have to try.
It's
really hard
interesting
to do
that you say that because I think a lot of the reasons that you are explaining right now are reasons why it's been hard for me to get into the comics world. Whereas for the MCU, I feel like I'm in control of it, or I like that it's contained, and it's getting increasingly complex as more recent installments, such as WandaVision, open up the possibilities of the multiverse, and that's where it might be going into that comic territory of having multiple realities, multiple timelines. But for what it is, as it stands, it's been really, really enjoyable and delightful for me to dive in and do that deep study of the 23 films plus WandaVision that are part of that cinematic universe at this time.
And I was going to sort of move in that direction because I find one of the things that I find interesting about the show, when I say the show, now it's confusing because now there actually are shows about the MCU as a whole, which now includes this TV show, is the it shouldn't have worked, right? It's like the level of interconnectivity is weird. You have people like Hannah and I watch like every movie, right? Like, I mean, we watch a lot more movies, so it doesn't surprise me that somebody like one of us would be into it. Wayne, you watch fewer movies, but you have a knowledge of comic books that goes back 1930, 90 years.
Time,
right? Like, but there's like 90 years worth of content floating around in your head or in my head about how this world or the DC world exists. And, there's a level of interconnectivity there, but you cannot, we talked about this on our in-game show and our Infinity Infinity War show. It's a lot to ask for somebody to, hey, I want you to start reading Tolstoy, but we're going to start at chapter 35, right? Like to just like tell somebody to jump into a middle of a book. And I think this one allows, so far, the MCU is more or less allowed for it in an interesting way. I had one friend of mine talking about it online. He's like, well, I've been watching this show, or should I? And I'm really enjoying it, even though I've not seen any Marvel movies. And I was like, why the fuck are you watching this?
Well, I think that actually this reminded me of Watchmen on HBO. And this probably will sound strange to some people until I explain what I mean. Everything you actually need to know about Wanda and Vision is baked into the show. Like, it begins like, WTF, what is going on? And actually is, I think, pretty accessible to an American audience who like grew up with a broad knowledge of sitcoms. And then like
you need to be about 25 or so. You need to be old enough to remember Nick at Night or to have watched the shows in the original.
Yeah, broad knowledge of but you watch it and it goes on, and then like they explain organically in the dialogue, oh, like, you're dead, why are you walking around Westview, Vision? And so like all the backstory, especially on episode 8, where it dives deep into Wanda's backstory and traumatizes its viewers in a good way. It's all there. So you can just watch WandaVision and not care about anything else, which honestly, if you don't have to watch Age of Ultron, you don't have to watch Age of Ultron. It's fine.
Which I think is honestly
what's really interesting is that the show has been an entry point for a lot of people, and it is an entry point. I don't, at least in my circles, I don't know anybody who is stopping at WandaVision. So I know some people, like people my age, so early 30s, people my parents' age, so, early 60s. And then also some of the very young teenagers who I teach, who are 14, 15 years old, who some who were already fans of some of the MCU movies, perhaps not completionists within the MCU, but, okay, I went to go see Endgame or whatever. But regardless, this has been the thing that has made them want to go back and revisit or visit for the first time some of those other films. And I do think that that is a testament to the MCU's nonlinear storytelling, that you can enter at different pathways. And it's been really, really cool to see, especially how this show is resonating with young girls who I'm teaching, who some who actually have some knowledge of these old sitcoms because of their parents or, watching it. And it's been really, really cool to see. And I do think that the intertextuality of the MCU and the way that it weaves these different storylines has been one among its biggest successes. And it's really interesting to see how WandaVision plays into that.
I think it's really interesting to hear that, like, basically, like, especially younger girls are responding to it differently. Because one of the things I remember, like, watching the show is, I mean, I'd agree. Like, I think one of the strengths of the MCU is, like, I've seen all the movies, but even then I don't keep track, I think, as much as some other folks do of, like, all the different stories. I don't know the order they're going in anymore. If I watch a movie,
Do you even care for the most part?
Well, that's the thing. Is like, I don't think, like, I think the great thing about the MCU is you don't have to. And I think but one of the things I found really fascinating about WandaVision in particular is, like, the aesthetic shift between what I associate with the, like, with like Marvel as a whole to how WandaVision particularly starts out was fascinating.
That was a brave choice on the part of the people, rather than just going with something safe.
Yeah, and I think it brought in people. I talked to a lot of people that, like, especially like my age, so, like, what, middle-aged millennial, the middle millennial. I have no idea how it works anymore. stuff. I don't know. But like, I know a lot of people that like have seen a lot of the Marvel movies, but maybe haven't seen everything. Mm-hmm. And like this show, especially like women my age and younger, I've seen like, they're like, oh, this is a thing that I see myself and I identify with because I used to watch those old sitcoms, or like I am into vintage fashion, or I like finding like Wanda herself really compelling. But I think just like the fact that it was so unexpected, I think intrigued a lot of people. I mean, myself included. I was just like, this is interesting. Which also, is that aesthetic shift like ever in the comics? I'm assuming based on what happened.
Well, okay. Yes, but not.
Not directly. There was a 12-issue Vision miniseries a couple years ago by Tom King, wherein he created a family of other androids. Wanda was not a part of this. And
she's a tertiary character. Yeah, she's barely in it.
Right, yeah, but she was not his wife in this. He creates an android wife and 2 android children and moves to the suburbs to live a normal life. And things go horribly awry because, that's what happens when you move to the suburbs.
As we all know that the suburbs are a dystopian nightmare. It's true.
Well, and there's also...
It was very definitely a I think, thematic influence on what WandaVision became.
Yes. Yeah. There's also very much a... Wanda first appears as his character in like 1964, right? So like there's been an aesthetic change just because time has marched on, even though 60 years haven't passed for her as a character. Like the artwork is always current. So I think it's there, but not as much, but as a meta level and not as much as a intentional portion of the story as it was in this. So I found rolling that in fascinating and interesting. It was one thing that sort of I was interested in as we were watching it, from week to week. And this is something that, Tara, you get to discuss it every week. We've mentioned it a couple times on the show, but we haven't done a full review. I'm reading just people's hot takes online. And there were a lot of traditional comic book fans sort of getting annoyed by episode 4, when they finally do the real world episode. They were like, well, it's about time, because there were a lot of people, they should have started the story here. And I disagreed. I like seeing the gradual tonal shift. I don't need to know that everything,
I agree.
Right. It's not a 2-hour movie. This was a TV show. It was a weekly TV show. I'm a big Twin Peaks fan, right? Like I want to be uncomfortable and confused. And it was pretty enough and interesting enough that like from the very first episode, I'm like, oh, okay, they're doing a Lucy. I get this. I understand how this works. I've seen a Lucy before. So I can follow along. And then the next episode, they're doing a Dick Van Dyke. Fine. All right. I'm on board. I don't need to know all the working parts in order to like follow it. I'm enjoying the ride in a way that I don't normally get to for this stuff, because so much of it pulls from Wayne. You and I have talked about, there's no surprise when Thanos destroys half the universe for us, because I'd read that comic book 30 years ago.
Right.
Like I knew what was going to happen. So now I have Wanda doing something. It's like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm on board for it. And I thought that the first episode that, in the middle, having an episode that focuses on Jimmy and Monica and Darcy, that was cool. And then waiting some more time inside the fictional universe. I want to see that. I want to see it develop, so much so that probably my least favorite episode of the series is the last one, because, we're going to do an MCU fight now. I mean, I guess.
And we kind of touched on that before we started recording as well. I think I'm on board with that episode being my least favorite of them.
Yeah, it was fine. I didn't hate it.
Right. I didn't hate it. There were things I thought were really good. But
do we want to talk about the finale and our feelings on it? Because
let's do that. For listeners, believe it or not, spoilers.
As if we
should have said that. Should have said that at the top of the show, but I feel like that was just painfully obvious.
Maybe Mab should record something and put the. I don't know.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
the show's going to be called like the WandaVision episode. I feel like they can make some educated guesses, and if not, they deserve whatever happens to them.
Right. Well, I guess we can just cut all this out.
Katya being mean to the listeners? No, that stays. Go.
Yeah, so actually I hate to say it, but I was kind of disappointed by the finale. I think part of it is that like it's a TV show, right? So it allowed for a lot more depth and more threads to be like drawn out. And I felt like they kind of dropped some of the threads in disappointing ways. Also, did like Kat Dennings like have somewhere else to film because she ran into Hayward?
Yeah, I think so.
I think so. Well, I think what happened, just as a little side, and I've seen other people speculating this as well, and I was wondering it, and then I looked for confirmation, couldn't find anything, just found other people speculating the same thing I did, which was I know that they were filming when COVID started. When COVID started, they had 2 episodes, or they were working on the last 2 episodes. I remember that being in the press. But they were farther along than Falcon and Winter Soldier, which was supposed to come out first. Falcon and Winter Soldier was completely shut down because they had to travel all over the world. WandaVision was mostly being filmed in one place. So they had, but they still weren't done. They locked down for a few weeks and then they came back and finished it. And my guess is Kat Dennings isn't in episode 8 at all. She had a small part in episode 9, and I'm guessing that she had moved on to somewhere else. And they like wherever she was, I'm guessing for scheduling, they probably couldn't get her back.
Yeah, that makes
I'm thinking they probably just had her sit on a soundstage somewhere and film like her one shot, and then they composited it in, because it's really just like it's literally she does her one thing. She's in one scene for 4 seconds, and then next time they mention her, like they're like, "Where's Darcy?" And Wu is like, "Darcy had to return to her home planet." There's no there's no rationalization. She's just like, she hates paperwork, so she left. Don't worry about it. And I think she just wasn't available.
Yeah, I mean, which like in context, like that's I'm not like it didn't ruin the show for me or anything. It's just like it felt like a lot of the minor, not like I guess major secondary characters, like their plot lines got kind of dropped towards the end. And obviously it's called WandaVision. I understand that, but I think it just I guess speaks to the like compelling performances of the secondary cast. Also, what really bothered me is that like Hayward, like far be it from me to argue for Dick to get more lines, but I think his characterization was strange on the whole, because at the beginning he seemed to be like an okay guy who like had a good relationship with Maria and then Monica, and like comforted Monica and asked her for a favor, and it seemed like she liked him to some degree, and like then he turned out to be the absolute biggest dick in the universe, and it never like it seemed like there was just no like dealing with that breakdown of a relationship whatsoever. And I also like I understand his plan to bring Vision back to life, but also I don't know. I guess like it just didn't feel like a very compelling villain story to me, which maybe he's just not a compelling villain and he's a dick, and there's more interesting characters like Agnes.
I mean, I think also
and Agatha.
Like, I feel like also part of it is like the villain story is like in some ways. I understood why it was there for like continuity with the overall like Marvel shtick. You always have to have a bad guy who's being awful, but like because like the central theme and the central plot line was centered around like Wanda basically dealing like fairly problematically with her trauma. Like in some ways, like there didn't really need to be a villain other than as a plot device. Is that just me?
No, I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
So what did other people think? Do other people like it? Or, I mean, Hannah gave her thoughts.
I found it kind of like similar. Like it felt very much like this is the conclusion to like what is essentially a prequel season. That like there's another story that's coming, and this was just sort of like a like waypoint. It didn't feel like a finale. And I think also aspects of it were really confusing. Sort of like I don't know what's up with like the weird like white Vision entirely, or what happened with that.
The fact that he just disappeared bothered me. Like the like I'm gonna fly off and find myself. That scene didn't feel finished to me.
Yeah,
and actually, your description of it sounds more complete than what actually happened on screen.
Yeah, and
right.
I think it was just like the finale more than like we were talking about how like this as a TV show it does a really good job of standing alone. I would say with the exception of the last episode. I think the last episode there at least as somebody who's like not super well versed in like either the comic books or the movies on that level, like it felt like there were allusions to a lot of storylines that I was kind of expected to like know in order to be like, oh well, that's going to happen and blah 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 blah, which I didn't. Like I spent a lot of time last night Googling, and I feel like I still don't know what was going on.
Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think that for me, a lot of the emotional arc of the story wrapped up in episode 8. And I thought that episode 8 bookended episode 1 in a beautiful way. And so I went into watching the finale to say, I already love this show. The show means a lot to me. I've found it incredibly powerful and an incredibly important installment into the MCU, both in terms of storytelling, how it fits into that larger web of storytelling and also on a metatextual level. However, so I kind of went into episode 9 with, I don't want to say lowered expectations because the show has consistently delivered on many fronts, but I went into it thinking whatever this finale is, it will be. I'm already satisfied because of the emotional arc of how it wrapped up in episode 8. So I think that's a really important point that Katya just made, because I think this is the one that's more like, okay, so now let's kind of set up where we go next in the MCU. So that's personally,
exactly how I felt.
I personally didn't feel like the lack of tying things up for the secondary characters was as disappointing, just because I am going to, be invested in where Monica Rambeau goes next in Captain Marvel 2, or where we see Darcy next in Thor: Love and Thunder, or et cetera and so on. But so that didn't bother me as much, but I did feel like this was much more the installment that is traditional MCU, which is, as a fan of traditional MCU, I'm almost surprised to say, therefore, it wasn't my favorite, because this show has transcended traditional MCU in such powerful ways.
I think that's a good observation, though, because I think one of the reasons, like, I was kind of like meh on the last episode was just like, oh, like this is like a convention of the MCU where like we are now going to set up the next thing. Because like I felt that way about some of the movies where it's like, okay, this is, even if they're not explicitly sequels, it's like this ending to this movie is clearly setting up whatever's coming next. And so,
all
like,
of Age of Ultron,
right? Exactly.
All of Age of Ultron is that movie. All of Age of Ultron is we're setting up other stuff.
In other contexts would bother me, but in Marvel movies it doesn't, because I just know that is part of the genre convention that they've built.
Okay, it bothered me in the sense that, like, I understand that they will reappear, but it felt like the show was building to something and building to something and building to something, and like the threads were connecting and converging. And when they did, the way they converged was disappointing to some degree. Like, for instance, Monica and Wanda are both dealing with grief. And I think like Wayne has talked a bit in like our conversations about how like, Monica recognizes this or sent us an article about that. And it felt like they were parallel and that their relationship was going to be very interesting. And then like when they finally met, it kind of fell flat. And I understand Monica's not the major character, but it seems like they like were giving her more. And then it was like, oh, but see you in Captain Marvel 2 when you go meet Nick Fury in the sky, instead of actually dealing with like your personal arc at the moment. That's just me.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
For me, it was much the same thing. I adore the MCU movies, right? And I watched every episode of this series. I watched when it dropped at 3 a.m, and then I went and watched it again later on that day with my wife. So I've seen everyone at least twice, and so I'm in. But for a lot of the same reasons that both Tara and Hannah were saying, there was so much of an emotional arc that I was enjoying the series for itself for 8 solid episodes. And I felt exactly the same way as Tara. The finale for me, most of that happens in episode 8. There's a few things with Wanda and her kids that sort of happen in episode 9, and her relationship with Vision that happened in episode 9. But most of the show for me is an 8-episode story. And then this final episode felt a lot to me. It felt too much like by the way, there's a Doctor Strange movie coming up, so we've got to set the stage. There was a lot of, even though they never explicitly say that, it just felt like such a weird tonal shift to being something that the show hadn't been about. And I do want to talk a little bit about, doing the outside research for comics, but I want to give Wayne a chance to say his thoughts on the finale before we do that. But like so much of it felt like white Vision existing. Katya, you said you were Googling it, and you would have Googled it and found nothing, because it was a garbage storyline that nobody liked 20 years ago. It was stupid. And like, why are we doing this other than to please comic book fans who like seeing Easter eggs, of which, you know, I am one, but I'd rather the story take precedence.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I don't care about White Vision. I just don't.
Yeah. I also, there's also kind of maybe this is too much morality speaking up, but Wanda just, spent several weeks keeping people hostage and taking over their minds, and like Dexter, she just gets to leave.
Yeah, she's like, do you hate me, Monica? And Monica's like, no, I don't hate you. I understand you. I'm like, okay.
And I get
that was a weird,
like giving her level of power. It's not like the military who was there was going to be able to take her into custody if she didn't want to be. But the fact is, like, yeah, I did this horrible thing. Okay, see, I'm going to my cabin.
That was weird, especially because there's like this entire like conversation ongoing between like her and Vision about like basically she has to kind of like be accountable for the fuckery she's done,
which like
doesn't happen at all. It's just sort of like shrug, and like I appreciate from the level of like it's about trauma and it's about grief, but it's like you don't get. I mean, IRL, you aren't, or at least you shouldn't be given a pass just because like you've done horrible things to people out of trauma.
Right. No. I just, as a follow up, Agatha wasn't completely wrong. Yeah, she was trying to steal her power, and she sees her as this greater threat, which she may be. But Agatha's like, look what you're doing. You did this to these people, and there are consequences. So that bothered me. And I guess maybe this taps into some bigger issues with just portrayal of women in power. The fact that the only plot line they seem to be able to do is Dark Phoenix. It bothers me. And I've done that with Wanda in the comics as well. I said before we started,
it was the best version of Dark Phoenix I've ever seen on screen. But still, it was. They had promised, they're like, well, we don't want to do just the story of a woman where she can't handle power, and it wasn't just that story.
Right.
But it wasn't just that story.
Yeah. And I said before we started recording, when we were just talking, and I've had this conversation with a couple of other friend groups this week, is you asking people, people who aren't as well versed in the comics background or whatnot, like, well, what should I read? And honestly, my favorite Wanda and Vision stories go back 30 years. I don't know that I've liked Wanda as a character since Avengers Disassembled in whatever that was, 2001. I kind of hate what they've done with the character in the comics since then. Because it's just become that, oh, look, she's powerful and crazy and destructive, and that's bad. And she was a character I grew up being very fond of. I was reading the reprints, Marvel Triple Action reprints of early Avengers story that do predate my reading day, of starting with issue 16 when they replaced the team of all the heavy hitters with Scarlet Witch, Quicksilver, and Hawkeye, who were all villains at that point. It was a major change up in the Avengers. It was Cap's Kooky Quartet, and the three of them being led by Cap. And to this day, those are some of my favorite classic Avengers stories. They are dated and they read like Silver Age comics, but there's something about them I love. And those three characters in particular are characters I have a tremendous fondness for because of that. And that level of power, it's like no one knows what to do with Wanda other than making her crazy. And yes, I blame Bendis, but that's all other fanboy thing.
Also, like, sort of generic Marvel question, like, I feel like, especially with female characters, there are male characters that do this, but like, especially female characters, there's an overwhelming theme of like, seems like an overwhelming theme to me of like, you only get to have power if you're traumatized.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That seems to be the standard origin of most superheroes. I mean, that's baked into it.
But I feel like it's foregrounded less with some of the male characters, I guess, is what, like, at least based off of my observation.
There's more options for male characters, so it's probably less noticeable. There are certainly, I mean, I don't want to make this a comic book show. There are certainly lots of overwhelmingly powerful male characters where this happens. Cyclops probably being one that you would know the name of, but there are others as well. And it's more the issue that I think what ends up happening is it's hard to write a story in comics where you have a member of your team who literally is a god. You have to take that person off the table in order to make every other story interesting, right? Like, you can't have Wanda hanging around the Avengers now because she can snap her fingers and create or destroy life. So therefore, why do we need Spider-Man? We don't, right? Like, there's an imbalance. And I think that there's this push to try to make strong female characters with scare quotes around them. by just making her physically the strongest. You know, like she literally, there's a line in WandaVision of, oh, you're more powerful than the Sorcerer Supreme now. And it's like, okay, that's why I find that uninteresting, not because she's female. I find a character of godlike power uninteresting. So so there's a little bit of that going on.
But yeah, I was thinking about to what extent we think the show, because you brought up kind of a moral perspective on this, Wayne, like, is the show warning against the unintentional consequences, the unintentional harm that you can do to others by entering into your own quote unquote bubble, your own echo chamber, your own whatever it may be, right? So Wanda's actions here, this is an extreme manifestation of what happens when you don't face your traumatic experiences head on. And they really nail that point down in episode 8 when Agatha is, as my friend referred to her, the mean therapist to Wanda. And
That's the best.
What I referred to as like the sassy ghost of Christmas past, to be like, hey, you know, only way forward is back. Like, you have to face your truth. And Monica says that in the show as well, right? Like, I have to accept my truth, right? So what I love about superhero stories so much is that they take this, they take these very real human issues and they create these fantastical, extremely dialed up iterations, manifestations of what that would be, right? So for Wanda, it's okay, I am so sad. Understandably, we see that pain in episode 8, and unintentionally she creates this thing. And at first I would also have a little bit of a concern of like, oh man, is this just the typical like woman can't control her emotions and it creates this thing? But I felt a little bit better when I compared it to Hulk, because Hulk also has that situation of like his emotions get out of control and things happen. So anyway, so unintentional consequences are that, you know, she takes over this town and the people there are feeling this grief as well. You know, where she becomes complacent, like where she becomes actively not okay here is the fact that once she realizes what she's done, she keeps it going. And that's the moral issue. I do think to a little bit of a credit of the finale, I guess, if anything, it does kind of bring back, okay, she decides that she is going to make the sacrifice of, hey, you know, again, I've entered into my safety net. I've entered into my comfort blanket, my echo chamber, whatever it may be. And I'm going to make the sacrifice of the comfort in the world I've created here so that these other people don't have to be hurt anymore. So I guess I was just wondering, like, where, like, is this the show making a commentary on our current world situation of escapism, or of, you know, like creating these own bubbles for ourselves and the unintentional harm that causes?
Yes.
Whether it meant to or not, it did.
Yeah. I concur.
I think it does. I mean, and I think maybe that ties into the whole thing we were talking about before with the creating our own, you know, safe space through media, right? That's like what we do with television, right? And I mean, both things like only watching the news network we want to, as well as, you know, I want to feel good about me. We've been in this pandemic for a year now, right? How often have I said I cannot watch news anymore? I'm going to watch The Office.
Right.
The Office is pleasant. You know, I'm just gonna pull up The Office or Community. You know, my wife and I watched all of Community.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a couple of episodes on how the fuck do we escape this.
Yeah, we've done. Yeah, right.
We're about to do it again.
But I think that
we're about to do it again, right?
Like, to complicate that a little bit, though, I think that it's hard to draw like a 1-to-1 analogy there, because like when I escape into like a video game, I'm not dragging 20 plus like up to like, you know, what is it? How many people in the town? Like thousands with me. Like I would actually, if there is like a closer analogy in my mind, it's closer to like more like algorithmic bubbles that we experience through like Facebook. Social media that way. Because like to me, it's like escaping into a TV show is one thing, because it's an interaction between you and whatever the media object is. And like, yes, there can be like extreme versions of that are really upsetting. Like I'm not denying that's not a thing, but like the idea of like where she's involving other people, it's more like I mean, this is also not a one-to-one analogy, but it's more like if Wanda was Q.
No, yeah,
I thought you were going to say if Wanda was Mark Zuckerberg, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sure.
But that's,
actually, that might be a better analogy.
Yeah. But no, I think the QAnon is right. We have people creating this quote unquote reality, putting it and dragging other people into it. Now, it's willing. It's not coercive in the same way that her powers are. Well, here's
what I'm wondering, because
people who post that stuff are certainly trying to convince others. They're trying to be coercive.
No, well, sure, but I'm going to psychoanalyze. I'm going to take Tara's point and go further. Right? This is trauma, right? The people who are susceptible to and trying, and again, if you follow me especially on Facebook, there's no shortage of idiots who argue with me this sort of nonsense, right? Mm-hmm. So I get it, but like it's not. I don't mean Q him or her or itself. Right. I mean the random people who are empowering Q by spreading this stuff. Mm-hmm. They're mostly not doing it maliciously. They're dealing with trauma, imagined though it may be, right? Mm-hmm. But they're dealing with something that scares them, and this is their escape. So they have found a fictional reality that they think that makes them feel better because they believe that Donald Trump is some space messiah built, sit down to save them all by keeping out the scary Mexican rapists. I mean, it's completely illogical, but it is this fiction that they are telling themselves. They share it because it makes them feel better. They've constructed a reality, and importantly, they do not perceive it as fiction.
Right. Neither does. I mean, even though Wanda. Right. This is one of the things I think the show does really well. Is it like performs like the show performs like the weird contradiction of immersive media, because like she is consciously aware at a certain point. Like maybe initially doesn't totally get what's going on, but she becomes consciously aware that she is living in a fantasy. But it is also so like in a practical sense real to her that in the sense of like, I mean, I distinguish all the time between real as like what actually exists versus real as what is meaningful. The second category, it absolutely is real. Like it is the ultimate. She has done the ultimate construction of personal meaning.
And because she has power, it matters, right? Like you want to say, okay, it doesn't matter if she's just one random woman who's lost her family and retreats into a psychological prison, then who cares? We put her in, we put her in a hospital, a mental health hospital, and we hope for the best, right? But she has power and it affects other people. But my extension would be at the point at which you're doing something like QAnon, maybe it's not one person, but it's thousands.
The aggregation of power. I mean, that's what
that power also matters.
Even in a positive way. Even in a positive way, that's how cultural reality is constructed. Cultural reality. Yeah, right. I mean, when we talk about things like hegemonic culture, hegemonic power, it's just basically the majority believes X, therefore X becomes functionally real, regardless of whether or not it's an accurate representation of reality. Right. Enter white supremacy and how we get the Capitol riots. Anyway,
but also, but to your point, also enter Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, right? It only works because it became this cultural thing that, I mean, Me Too worked at all because enough people believed that if they told their story,
it would matter.
And said Me Too, it would matter. And it's an aggregate of power, right? But at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of people typing 2 paragraphs of their own personal trauma online. It was the aggregate of that power that mattered, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do actually have a question for Katya specifically.
Yo.
So I thought of you as episode 8 began, because it began with the Salem witch trial flashback with Agatha's origin story. And also she has bunnies that she carries around. And I thought, I want to know your thoughts. That's literally it.
Okay, so this is why I love this show a lot, actually. So for for listeners who have not heard me wax poetic about my dissertation previously, I wrote it in my PhD. My dissertation was on virtual reality starting in the 1690s with the Salem witchcraft trials. That is a different episode to go into why the hell that works. But I think but I will talk about it really briefly in the sense that I find it fascinating that a TV show that is basically about Wanda constructing her own reality and the boundaries between like what I was talking about earlier, between like reality is what is objectively real, concrete, exists versus what is meaningful and feels substantive. and like the way that those two things like are both legitimate in their own ways and really complicated and sometimes conflict with each other. I don't know. The witchcraft thing, this is what I hope later on they deal more with like the mechanics of witchcraft in the MCU universe, because I find this fascinating, because fundamentally like witchcraft is also basically in many of its iterations was persecuting people, specifically women, who challenged what was real. So for example, in like the Puritan conception of witchcraft, part of what their belief was is that basically what allowed witchcraft to happen was that witches could basically act in the divine space, which to them was a real like physical space, in a way that mortals weren't supposed to be able to do. So basically witches could pretend to be gods by basically shaping reality in ways that they weren't supposed to be able to do, which is exactly what Wanda's doing.
Agatha mentions that in one throwaway line, and that's it. She does say this is men not being able to deal with women who can. She does say that literally in one line, and then never mentions it again.
Yeah, it's a gender thing, but it's also like what happens when you like, and this is part of like why I think about virtual reality and why I think it's an important to look back historically, even if it's not as a technology, is because what happens when you acknowledge that reality is just not reality as human beings experience it goes beyond what physically exists. Like when you acknowledge that reality itself is not objective, in most points in history, people that terrifies people. Like there have been riots about it. I mean, they say like arguably the Salem witchcraft trials, as well as many other witchcraft trials, were about like the idea that we don't understand reality is horrifying, and and then on top of that, the idea that we could actively change it is even more terrifying. And some people respond to that as like, okay, well, that means that we have control and therefore we can change things. So there's possibility there. And then for other people, it's like, no, that's horrifying because we're just going to break it. I mean, even if to bring it to like a real world example, like think about the way people respond to narratives about climate change, right? Like the idea that you can acknowledge, I mean, take religious belief in God out of it, although that's definitely part of it. Like once you acknowledge that human beings can affect the entire trajectory of the planet, you have one of two responses. One is you're like, okay, something's wrong. We now need to like mobilize en masse to fix it. And then you become a climate change activist. Or you are like, no, that is a horrifying prospect, because how could we possibly deal with a problem that big? I'm going to deny that this is happening because I cannot process it. Anyway, that's my initial response. At some point, like if listeners are interested in hearing more about the weird, like the reality thing, I don't want to get completely derail this episode, but I think WandaVision, more than most other TV shows, I think does a really good job of like acknowledging that subjective parts of reality are equally real, because you see Wanda, her relationship with her family. Yes, they're not physically real in the way that we think of objective reality, but they are absolutely real in a subjective sense, in the sense of they add meaning to her existence. It's also, I mean, it also goes to the idea that like culture is part of reality. We often distinguish reality and culture as if culture is this made up thing. Culture is made up, but part of my point is reality is partially made up. We make it up because we decide how we articulate reality. I mean, to go back to the QAnon thing, like to that community, I mean, that is real. You know, in the same way that for
matters.
In the same way that for Puritans, witchcraft was real. It was the best explanation they had for the things going on around them. Yes, it killed people, but that's part of the point. Like what you believe about the world, what you believe to be real, kills people sometimes.
And then rolling that back into the show, this is exactly the problem with what I was getting at with the QAnon stuff. This is the problem for Wanda, right? Like, because, you know, she has the ability she doesn't need consensus. She has the power to make manifest her belief and her trauma all by herself, right? That's kind of what makes her stronger.
She can enforce consensus.
Right. And she does, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
Just a consensus sounds reasonably so. A lot like consent, and just there's a whole lot of consent issues there that like still trouble me. We talked a little bit about the super sex episode. We didn't have all the information, but I'm still quite uncomfortable with Wanda and like lack of consent. And we've already like mentioned this like a billion times since 2021 began. But what is it with all these narratives where women are like exerting their power over people, and they are the like they are the ones violating consent in extremely disturbing ways.
Because I think we have a hard time telling a different story about power.
See, like, also Wonder Woman.
Well, Wonder Woman was just a straight up rape. It wasn't about power.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is because we struggle to tell a different story about power. And I think it's more glaringly obvious when it's about women wielding power because we are not trained to see women in that way. Because I'm sure that everyone else in the episode could probably pull up better examples than I can from like the Marvel universe particularly, but like those stories also appear with male characters, but they don't immediately, at least I have noticed myself, like I don't immediately find them just like as uncomfortable because it's normalized, right?
It relates a lot to how people are responding to the movie I Care a Lot.
Well, just
I don't think you said you can't think of something, Katya. I think you're just because it's accurate. That's you're right.
The example comes up with me in Jessica Jones, the Purple Man, Kilgrave. He's exerting his control over other people. He's making them do things against their will. Exactly what Wanda's doing.
Also, the fact that there is I realize that this exists for everything, but like the fact that there is a internet subculture that thinks that Kilgrave is like unbelievably sexy horrifies me.
Also, Frollo.
He has a fan club. This is literally like a sociopathic rapist, guys. Like,
also,
no.
This is like a thing on the internet. Like they pick characters like this, like Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's so weird. I usually don't comment on people's fan choices, but this one, no.
Thanos also. There are a lot of sexy Thanos memes. It's a thing.
Go read Baldface.
Yeah, because genocide is hot. Okay, guys, eugenics bad. Eugenics bad.
Yes.
You know this. Now that we've had our wonderful discussion of the boundaries of reality, unfortunately, Katya has to disintegrate because of the time-space continuum and reasons. But I will talk to y'all later, and I'm excited to hear the rest of this episode because WandaVision is great. I love it. Finale notwithstanding.
Thanks, Katya.
Bye, Katya.
Bye.
The rest of us are going to keep talking.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, there were a few other things because we had a couple of comments, and let's start with the one that's not on the blog because it's Hannah's. So Hannah, this is I've seen these think pieces as well, but you had some questions about it. So why don't you ask them?
Oh, basically, the largest critique I've seen of WandaVision on Twitter, where I'm not really, but sometimes hang out, is that people were very interested in discussing or wanting to know why Wanda was portrayed in the MCU as a white European woman when her heritage in the comics has been Romani, and also that her parents are Holocaust survivors, depending on the narrative. So, they were troubled by some of the allusions to that or the ignoring of that. So I basically, as someone who, again, has not followed the character very well since his inception, I said, hey, Wayne and Mav, what are your thoughts?
and Mav beat me to it. But he pretty much said exactly your response to Hannah was.
So, yeah, the accusation was, well, this is yet another version of whitewashing, right? And my problem with that is complicated. I mean, it is maybe, but maybe not, because in the case of Wanda and Pietro, their heritage and history is what I would call multiple choice throughout the comics. And I gave a brief rundown. We have in our chat that we go back and forth on, but I found another one, or Anna Papard, friend of our show and, host of my other podcast. She sent me a link to just someone had done the timeline. It's ridiculous. What their nationality is and who their parents are have flipped back and forth so many times. But my brief thing was Magneto first appears in X-Men in 1963. Wanda and Pietro are introduced as his lackeys in 1964. Then, as Wayne alluded to earlier, they suddenly become Avengers in 1965. Throughout the 60s and 70s, they flip-flop back and forth as to who their parents are several times. They're vaguely European, or maybe they're American. For several years, their parents were two Golden Age American superheroes named The Wizard and Miss America. So those were their parents probably when Wayne was growing up, like when you were reading comics.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that story overtly. Like that was a storyline I was very invested in when I was 12 or whatever.
And then, like, by the time I'm reading comics, that's still true. But there's this revelation in a 1982 limited series called Vision and Scarlet Witch. There's this revelation that secretly all along Magneto was their parents and was their father.
Which narratively makes far more sense given the history than anything we'd seen before.
Right. But like, really, I'm pretty sure they just decided this purely based on the fact that Pietro and Magneto both had white hair.
Yeah.
It was, there was no good reason for it. They just said it all of a sudden. And at the same time, in 1982, you start doing these stories where Chris Claremont, who's writing X-Men at this time, starts writing stories about how implying, never out and out saying, but implying that Magneto is a Holocaust survivor, particularly in his 1980s comics and his graphic novel God Loves Man Kills, which came out in 82, I think. And there, it's heavily implied that he's a Holocaust survivor. He talks about it a lot. He says, this is just like my childhood, except for this time it's the mutants instead of the Jews. He says something like that. But it's not a big deal. It just sort of, Claremont intended it for him to be Jewish, but it was sort of backstory. And then that goes on for a while. Claremont wrote that story. The Magneto is Wanda and Pietro's father story is written by Bill Mantlo. And if you're reading both books, it's very clear that Mantlo and Claremont are not talking to each other about this at all. It's just two arbitrary decisions that were made by two separate writers, completely unconnected. And then you fast forward a while, and by the time the X-Men movie comes out in 2000, that's when that movie explicitly shows Magneto growing up in a concentration camp. So it's like, yes, he is Jewish. He is a Holocaust survivor. So that's when they roll it back into the comics and they start making it explicitly that Magneto was a Jewish man. But it was never part of Wanda's story. It was, she is his daughter, but she wasn't raised by him. So if she is half Jewish and half Romani, she's adopted regardless and not raised by either family. So she's got no cultural awareness of it. She's drawn as just a random white woman. And it has flipped back and forth so many times that you're not even sure of any of that.
She was raised by an anthropomorphic cow.
Yeah, she's raised by a cow, believe it or not, in her and Pietro, which is even weirder. And then in 2014, Marvel just undoes all of that and says, by the way, Magneto was never their parent.
We don't know who is.
This was all. This was all a lie. We don't know who is. And this was not for any race reason so much as it was a rights issue over movie rights. They just undid it because the Fox owned the X-Men movies. And then like 2019 or no, 2019 or 20, Disney buys Fox. So now Disney has the rights to the character, to the mutants again. So it's completely unclear. And I don't know that it's whitewashing because for all of his other problems that we are not getting into in this episode, Joss Whedon grew up reading. Joss Whedon is roughly Wayne's age. So when he grew up reading comics, they were absolutely the children of the Wizard and Miss America adopted. So he would have grown up with characters who are white. That's who he would have remembered from his childhood, because, and there's been so many different variations. There's just no way for him to have done one that was true. So that didn't really bother me. I think it could have been interesting, but I also think Lizzie Olsen is amazing at this role. So
and I have
more of a missed opportunity than a active whitewashing, it seems.
Yeah.
And a question. Has there ever been like a person of color or even like a female writer like write Scarlet Witch in the comics that you can think of? Or is it just sort of
yes,
dudes? There
have been.
Oh, cool.
Not for any notable runs or anything like that, but on occasion, sure. But she's in all honesty, there's no definitive run for Wanda in the comics that I can think of. Like the most notable thing that's ever happened to her that has been interesting is probably this show we just watched. Honestly, she's not, it's a lot of, it's an interesting idea for a character, but she's so vaguely defined that most of her comics run has been bad, for lack of a better way to say it.
I think some of it has been, for the longest time, her powers were poorly defined. When I was reading those Cap's Kooky Quartet Avengers, she had hex powers, which meant she pointed her finger and weird shit happened. And it could be kind of anything, which I guess is where that reality shaping stuff came later.
It was whatever they needed to happen in that issue, she could just do.
Mm-hmm. And they later defined it as probability changing. Like, her mutant power was to change probability. So that's what made these world changes, these things that changed the world around her. And then eventually she was trained in actual magic by Agatha Harkness.
And Doctor Strange, depending on different
Doctor Strange. Yes. And now she has the power to completely change reality. So,
although I guess we could at least say in terms of her backstory or just like this issue, we all could do with some more like understanding of like portrayals of like the Romani on screen and in other mediums. Because honestly, like I have been ignorant to some of these issues for years. I didn't actually realize like that a lot of people like found this to be a problem. And a lot of people do not know that there is a common word that is actually a slur used to describe the Romani. They don't realize that the G word is a slur. And I didn't for a long time either.
Well, that's what she was. She was originally, she was just vaguely European, like I said. Once they decided she was Romani, they didn't decide she was Romani. They decided she was Gypsy at first, which is what you're going for. And then it became Romani later once they found out. It was really not.
Yeah, and Avengers in the 90s when George Perez was drawing the book, he redesigned her, and the costume was absolutely a take on very classic / cliche images of that.
Yes, it was the Hot Topic version that you find on Halloween.
Yeah.
A lot of her costumes are
sexy.
Sexy. Yeah. That's
just, there's a long like history of that, like including in the 19th century.
So we had some other questions that, I just want to address from the comments. John Dorowski, our very first guest ever, he mentioned a couple of things. First off, he said, "Is there anything better than Vision in a turtleneck?" No, we just all agree, right? That's awesome. But he also said he likes the storytelling nature of the show. Unlike Disney's other big success, The Mandalorian, WandaVision isn't really episodic in that you could just pull out an episode and enjoy the story. What is driving the show is the bigger narrative, and I find myself watching mostly for clues rather than each episode's story. This was especially true of the early episodes where they hewed closely to the sitcom format, but many of the jokes did not land, which itself brings up a question of intentionality. Was the fact that the jokes didn't work together another clue that there was something fundamentally wrong in Westview? Or was it that the creators couldn't decide whether to celebrate or satirize sitcoms, resulting in dissonant messaging? Watching the show for clues, both obvious and subtle, to the grand narrative means that if the resolution is not satisfying, it will retroactively cast a shadow over the whole series. Since the clues are often references to stories in comic books, there is also a question of accessibility. At what point do the references, some of which are essential to the story, become a barrier to enjoyment rather than a feature? While I pick up many of the references, other members of my family, not steeped in comic book lore, have been puzzled about them and need to ask for clarification, meaning that they are lost rather than enjoying the episode in the moment of viewing. And that's, I think, Tara, that you're perfect for this because you don't know any of it, right? Like your clues are all from a deep dive across all the movies, but you're never going to be confused by or even care about, oh, okay, look, she named the kids Tommy and Billy. That means something because you wouldn't have known who they were until they showed up.
Yeah. So to be fair, being part of the, I guess, larger creator community of content around the MCU, I do get drawn into some of the conversations that include comics stuff. So something like through osmosis, I knew who Billy and Tommy were and that they were coming. And I knew who Agatha Harkness was just through osmosis of the conversations that were happening around WandaVision. So for me, that's something that kind of I talked to you earlier, this idea of this show serving as an entry point for some people into the larger MCU to say, who is this Ultron guy? Maybe I should go watch that movie or whatever, for better or worse. But for me, it's been that, oh, wow, that's really fascinating. So I can listen to podcasts or read stuff online about Agatha Harkness in the comics or Wiccan and Speed in the comics and be intrigued by it. And it encourages me to go ahead and pick up some of those comics at some point as well. Mm-hmm. Again, to reiterate, I'm a little bit intimidated by the entire world of the comics just because there is so much content out there. But I do think it's interesting that, those little things that are references within the show, I was still getting satisfaction out of it more kind of after the fact, doing the reading and engaging in that fan community online.
Yeah, I mean, some of the Easter eggs are just that. I mean, in one of the early episodes when she's at the grocery store, there's a poster at the store with advertising milk, and there's a picture of a cow. I'm like, yeah, that's Bova. That's the
cow lady who raised her.
Cow lady, right? And it's just like, okay, that's a nice little Easter egg. This means nothing for this show. And that's fine.
The Grim Reaper's helmet's hidden in an episode. You don't know who, you don't need to know who it is. It's just there in case you're a comic book fan. And I'm okay with Easter eggs like that.
Yeah.
I still maintain my stance that you do not have to read a single comic book or watch a single movie to understand the basics of, of course you might not notice like these Easter eggs, but also you probably don't care about them.
Right.
Yes.
You're not someone like Mav or Wayne.
Yeah. I have one exception. I do have one exception to that, which was because I wanted to, that's why I picked this letter. I wanted to dovetail into it a little bit. I thought, and I don't know if anything's going to happen about this. Like we were talking earlier, maybe we'll see Darcy again, maybe we won't, but at least, there's unfulfilling bits of her story I want to know. Maybe we'll see Jimmy again, maybe we won't. I imagine they were popular enough we will. I don't know if we're going to see fake Pietro again, and that irritates me because I felt that was problematically done. Not just because I know who Evan Peters is. I know, I have external information from, intertextual connections to the other X-Men universe, right? I know who that character is. And I felt like they went out of their way to not just make it an Easter egg, to set up a mystery with no payoff. And I felt like they were just calling me stupid as a viewer. And this is different from like I saw a lot of fans who were like, "Oh, Mephisto's coming," and I remember talking to you, to Wayne, about this. I knew Mephisto wasn't coming from episode 1. I was like, "No, this is stupid." Because in every episode that we got further, like I saw people saying, "Oh, we're gonna find out about Mephisto or Cthulhu in episode 9 on episode 8," and I'm like, my wife is watching this show. My wife's seen like 5 MCU movies. She's read like a dozen comic books in her life, and she's enjoying this show. And if you just in the literal 9th hour, if you on the 9th episode, you suddenly just drop the devil incarnate in, then I can never make her watch an MCU thing again. Like you can't do that, right? Because because that would be bad storytelling. You only want this because you know comic book lore, and I don't want the show to rely on comic book lore. So I was never expecting that. I was never expecting necessarily a Benedict Cumberbatch cameo for Doctor Strange. But when the show goes out of its way to create a mystery around Pietro, who suddenly is back from the dead, who they go out of their way to say, they don't just like bring in another guy. They bring in a guy who looks different, and they cast the actor that played him in another movie. Like you're working to make me ask questions. And then for the last episode to say, there's no question. We just decided to screw with you. That annoyed me. It annoyed me as a viewer, and it was the only time.
I had a different take on that, which I understand what you're saying. But like, I think that they were more interested in like doing a payoff that was specifically for the show, because they mentioned like Ralph and all the jokes, which I'll get back to that in a second. But like you in episode 7, like there are these like hints about like, is he like coming, like is he like from like Hayward? Has he like been there to like mess with Wanda? That's like kind of the first hint you get that like she's not controlling everything, because she's like, I didn't do this, and Vision doesn't believe her, but I actually believed her. And then you realize that it's Agnes, and he like he comes up behind Monica at the end of episode 7, and that's a thread that gets pulled together in episode 9, and then we discover that Ralph actually exists. What bothered me more because I was like, oh, Ralph isn't just like a sitcom joke. He actually like is a person like living in Agatha's home. What bothered me more is like all the jokes Agatha made. And I'm like, I can't tell like if you were just joking because these were like, you know, innuendo jokes that fit like the sitcom-y thing, or if it's just another example of, once again, like weird women consent control issues. But also a lot of people I know are upset because they basically used him for a boner joke. So I understand.
Yeah, to me, I read it as Agatha's just joking. She knows the sitcom formula. I don't think she's really living married to this guy. I think he's just part of the joke. And I don't care. Like, I didn't need there to be a real Ralph because Agatha is aware of the sitcom logic, right? Like, she could have just done it because that's what the kooky neighbor is supposed to do, right? So fine. I didn't need that. And I didn't. And like if you just cast Evan Peters to play the new Quicksilver and said he was Aaron Taylor, that would have been fine. Like, it's only toying with the emotions of the audience. And that irritates me when writers do that. If you're going to have a swerve, if you're going to do something clever and you do something with it, Knives Out. Knives Out is a brilliant movie that is all about taking my expectations as someone who has seen a bajillion mystery movies and books in my life and making me like make assumptions based on them and then doing a twist to bring me to some satisfying conclusion. They didn't do that here. They relied on me knowing how movies worked and having comic book knowledge and having, MCU knowledge. And then they said, and the twist is, doesn't matter, fuck you. And that irritates me. It irritates me as a fan because it's lazy writing.
I think they did this. I think they did this with better results with Guardians of the Galaxy 2, because what they did in all the press is they were like, oh, let's talk about the new villain Aisha. And like, I cared just enough about Guardians of the Galaxy 2 that I was like, oh yeah, she's like the major villain, and I believe them. And then of course there's a twist and she's not actually the major villain, and it's a like surprise because they use the fan knowledge against you. So I think what they were trying to do in this, and again, I'm not saying like it worked. I think they weren't actually trying to like make you mad. I think they were trying to use your like fans, like major fans' expectations against them so they would get a surprise. The surprise did not perhaps pay off in a way that any of us enjoyed. If that makes sense. If that explanation of what I'm trying to say makes sense.
And in a lesser show, it wouldn't have bothered me. It's because this was so good, right? If Inhumans makes a stupid decision like this, whatever.
I forgot that existed. I forgot that was a show.
Right. Inhumans
so made about halfway through the run.
Yeah. Inhumans is awful, right? In so many ways. So whatever. But when that for me was the biggest misstep of this show, and it was the thing that I actively hated, as opposed to like there was a lot that happened in episode 9 that I didn't care about. I'm like, okay, they're doing an MCU thing. This is neat, I guess. That was the one thing where I was like, you just pulled me out of the show. You made me feel like I wasted time. Like, I don't care if there's if I'm trying to figure out, what's my theory on how this is going to happen? Who is behind the bubble? I think maybe Agatha is behind the bubble. Nope. It really was Wanda. That's fine because there's an answer you've given me a fulfilling answer to the question, and I don't mind being wrong. But if you make me waste my time for 8 weeks on a question that you have no intention of answering.
Well, and part of it was that reveal. When he showed up at the door, there's the meta thing of the sitcom, Darren Stevens thing of they've recast him. The fact it was this person who has played Quicksilver from another universe. We all know the next Doctor Strange movies is about the multiverse. Like, there was a better story to tell given that reveal, and they didn't tell it.
Or come up with an even better story that's not the one that I'm thinking of, right?
Yeah.
Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Far From Home. That was not the story. I was like, oh, okay, they're going to do the multiverse story with Mysterio. That's a choice, I guess. And we had all these fan theories, and that's not what it was. But they had a different story. There was a story there. I loved that movie. I thought that movie was great. And if you're going to do the he tag, then you do what they did with J.K. Simmons in there. It's like, look, we're bringing the same guy in. Think about that, right? That's interesting. But when I
expect a payoff with that, which is I did with Quicksilver.
And I didn't get one. I got a payoff of a very lame dick joke. Like, that was why I don't care.
I've gone punchy.
Yeah, we've probably resolved nothing here at this point.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear your takes on it. I wasn't angered by it. I think that although I would say that I was disappointed, I was kind of like, oh, all right. I kind of wanted him to be an entryway into the multiverse and to connect to Fox Universe Pietro. But when he didn't, I was like, all right, they didn't go in that direction. But it is interesting to hear your take on it, Matt, because we can't ignore the people who are pulling the strings in terms of the writing and the directing and those conscious decisions that they made to fake fans out or to maybe lean into that week to week speculation stuff that they knew was going to happen. Ultimately, I think the week to week format for this show served it very well. And I think it's been a really interesting singular January 2021 experience. And like I said, the show and the week to week experience has transcended generations and really speaks to the zeitgeist of what's going on right now in interesting ways. But yeah, you have me thinking about it a little bit more now because I took it less as like a fuck you and more as that's kind of disappointing, but it's interesting.
And I probably wouldn't be bothered by it as much if it weren't the only thing that I didn't like in 9 solid weeks of television.
Because it has been so tight, right? The writing has been so intentional, so intentional.
I love this show. So this one, like, to me, it's like this. There's this one thing which is an absolute stinker. We haven't even talked about, like, every time there's a new Marvel thing that comes out, you guys recall this. Every time there's a new Marvel thing comes out, I hear people saying, oh, well, that should win all the awards this year. Like, I remember when we talked about when Black Panther came out and people were like, how is Chadwick Boseman not nominated for an Oscar for this? And I was like, well, he's okay in it. I mean, he's really good. And it was like, well, he's clearly the best performance of the year. And I was like, no, I've seen other movies that aren't superhero movies. You can't, and then people have I've seen people like say Lizzie Olsen deserves like Emmy buzz for this. And yeah, kinda. She was real good. I watch a lot of TV and yeah, she kind of does. She was excellent in this. Katherine Hahn was excellent in this.
Yeah.
Paul Bettany was excellent in this. And then there were little bits that, people who, like, my favorite character, like, ongoing in the show was Monica. I thought that she, like, I thought Teyonah Parris worked her ass off doing so much and telling me so much story that I am intrigued by on, just in subplots. She gets one episode to herself, but most of it is like subplots. And I just loved it. I loved watching. My favorite scene is the reintegration scene where you see the reverse blip. That was amazing. I love that about her. And then I loved watching. I mean, I'm very much on the team of people who want there to be a reboot of the X-Files starring Darcy and Wu. I think that would be great, right?
Yes.
like I will watch the show. Please make that happen. But my singular favorite performance in the entire show, and this is a testament to how good it is, and I don't even know the actor's name because he's so small. The part of Norm, Vision's coworker Norm, in the one scene where Vision first starts really figuring out that something's wrong, and he's at work, and he lays his hands on the side of Norm's head, wakes him up from the hypnosis. Norm goes into his real life, freaks out, goes crazy, screams about, take care of this, talk to my sister, what's going on, is my dad okay? And then Vision realizes that he's overwhelmed, and he puts him back under, and he goes back to being smiley, happy-go-lucky. It is the best performance that I've seen somebody do an emotional shift. Kudos to that guy. The guy's got literally 3 minutes of screen time throughout the entire series run. Right. But in that scene right there, I was like, that was phenomenal acting. I was like, it was fucking amazing. I remember rewinding and going just to watch it again. It's like that subtle shift to he just on a dime goes from happy-go-lucky to abject terror back to happy-go-lucky without a camera break. And I was like, good job, dude. I don't know who you are. I hope you get more work.
It looks like his name is Asif Ali.
Good for him.
Yeah, he's great.
I am now an Asif Ali fan. I've got to find him out. I'm not joking. I want to see him in other stuff because that was good acting. And not that I obviously I love these movies, but that's not the kind of performance that you usually see in a random MCU film, because it's not about that. You gotta make room for the explosions, and this basically stayed away from explosions till the last episode. So yeah, you're right. We've resolved nothing.
If you like Randall Park, you should go watch Always Be My Maybe, because it's really good. That we can resolve. I don't know. I was very excited about like Randall Park and more stuff, and then I realized there's already a great rom-com that doesn't like suck, and he's really good in it.
I do. All right. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. But
no. I was going to say, and we didn't even talk about the ship of Theseus.
Oh man, yeah. How did we not talk about the ship of Theseus?
Well, I thought that was. I've seen a couple people complaining about like that being a dumb part, and I'm like, no, that was awesome.
I liked it. I thought it was awesome.
I love that. No, Vision's not going to fight himself. Vision's going to, have an interesting philosophical conversation.
Yeah, it was perfect. I loved it.
Also, if anybody else complains about the line about grief being love that like lingers on, I'm going to throw something.
I hadn't heard anybody complain about it, but
yeah, I thought it was largely celebrated. I thought that people seemed to be into it, at least in my circles.
I follow people who like are like us, and then people who have no like love for the MCU, and a lot of people were making fun of it, and they are wrong. And that is all. I thought it was
insightful. Well, I think we'll be doing another one of these. I can't imagine that we're not going to have things to say about Falcon and Winter Soldier. Because how could we not, right?
Well, I mean, maybe something else will happen, or it'll be a letdown after this. They've set the bar high.
Yeah, but I do want to thank Tara for joining us. Tell people about your show one more time. Where they can find you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a blast. I have been really excited to join you guys, and I love the types of conversations that you have. And if anybody would like to hear more of my thoughts on WandaVision or other installments of the MCU, my show is called There Was an Idea, ... a Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. And I'm on Twitter and Instagram at @anidea_podcast if anybody wants to say hello.
We'll link you in the show notes.
Thank
and Palindrome Hannah.
Just go watch Always Be My Maybe. It's really good. I have nothing to plug. You know I have nothing to plug.
I know, but I always like seeing what you do plug. So Palindrome. So Hannah's plug is go watch Always Be My Maybe, which is a movie that you have nothing to do with other than you like it.
Hey, maybe people watch it and be like, oh, this was really good. Maybe you guys should do an episode about this and how funny Keanu Reeves was in it. And the answer is yes. Okay.
And for another non-plug, Wayne.
Yeah, I got nothing.
I don't even know why we do this part of the show.
It's a pandemic. There's nothing going on. I guess maybe we can start talking about it some. PCAC in a virtual event in June. I did have oddly enough, Nicole approved my proposal.
Yes, the person in charge of who's been on this show 18 times. Yes. Right. We'll be talking about that as it comes closer.
Yeah, I guess I'm promoting the fact that I'm actually working on something for somebody. So, which is unusual this past year.
Yeah. And as always, let's see, you can find me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, all of the places, always at Chris Maverick. You can also follow me on my other show, on Gosh Golly Wow, with friends of the show, Anna Papard and Andrew Damon. We discuss Excalibur, the comic book Excalibur, one issue at a time for 127 straight weeks. We're now on week 3. and it's just like I'm starting realizing this is gonna be something. But anyway, yeah. And you can follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, always at Vox Popcast. You can follow the show's blog at www.voxpopcast.com. And if you enjoy the show, and we certainly hope you do, please subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever the hell else you get podcasts from. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel has video versions of this show where you can hear us talk. You can see images of whatever we're talking about. It also has the Gosh Golly Wow podcast that you can follow there as well. And do us a favor, if you subscribe to us there, that helps us out. Subscribe to us, hit bells, comment, like, all of the YouTube things that I do not understand. Also, leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast venue you use, especially Apple Podcasts. That helps us out by making the show more popular. It links us to other people's shows. We move up in the algorithms. People throw money at us from the skies, or so I'm told. It has not happened yet, but I would really like it to. I would once again like to thank Tara for joining us, and please go listen to her show. I'd like to thank Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out. I'd like to thank you at home for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.